My name is Claudette Jones, and for years, my life was a closed book to my only son, Damian. He knew me only through the bitter stories his father told and the poisonous nickname they pinned on me, the wretched woman. For a long time, I carried that name like shackles, dragging them across every step I took. But what Damian didn't know was that the woman he thought broken, forgotten, and discarded had risen from those ashes. And when his voice finally found its way back to my ear after decades of silence, it wasn't to mend a bond. It was to wound me deeper. The call came on a quiet afternoon. I was sitting in my study, a room filled with ledgers, property deeds, and documents that spoke of the empire I built in secret. My phone rang, the screen flashing a number I didn't recognize. Something in me, maybe the tremor in the air, maybe the tug of blood you can never sever, made me answer. Claudette, the voice said first, as if twisting the knife by refusing to call me mother. I stiffened. The voice had changed since the last time I heard it as a boy, but I would have known it anywhere. It's Damian. For a second, the world went still. I hadn't heard my son's voice in more than 20 years. Not through birthdays. Not through the years I spent clawing my way back from nothing. Not through the nights I cried into a pillow, wondering if he even remembered the sound of my laugh. Now, here he was, cutting through the silence as if no time had passed. "I'm getting married," he said flatly. His words carried no warmth, no hesitation. "Of course, you'll want to be there." My heart clenched, not because of the invitation itself, but because of the tone. I waited, and then the sneer I knew was coming slithered down the line. "I'll finally get the chance to show everyone what I've told them about you. The wretched woman. You'll sit there in your rags, and they'll see you for what you really are." For a moment, I let his words hang heavy. If I were the woman he still believed me to be, those words would have broken me. They would have sent me spiraling back into shame, into hiding, into silence. But that Claudette had died long ago. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, my lips curling not into a sob, but into a laugh. A quiet, steady laugh that carried more steel than sorrow. "I'll be there," I said simply. Then I hung up. In that instant, I knew exactly what Damian had done. He had given me my stage. For years, I had built in silence, risen in shadows, never flaunting the power and wealth I had gathered. I had dreamed of the day he would see me, not because I wanted his approval, but because I wanted the lies to end. And now, by trying to disgrace me, he had arranged my grand entrance. I sat back in my chair, staring at the city skyline beyond my window. My reflection stared back, not of a woman crushed, but of one sharpened by fire. Damian thought he would bury me once more. Instead, he had summoned the ghost of the past he could never kill. That day, I stopped being the wretched woman. That day, I became something far more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose, and everything left to prove. To understand why my son spat the words wretched woman, like venom, you have to walk with me into the years when that name first took root. I wasn't always the Claudette Jones who commands boardrooms and steps out of Rolls-Royces. Once, I was just Claudette, the girl from the wrong side of town who believed that marrying Howard Jones meant my hard days were behind me. Howard came from a family that thought themselves better than most. His parents ran a small trucking company, respectable enough to give them heirs, and they never let me forget I was an outsider. At our wedding, his mother whispered to her sister loud enough for me to hear, "She doesn't belong in this family." I brushed it off at the time, blinded by the love I thought I had. What I didn't know then was that those whispers would grow into shouts, and those shouts into the ruin of my name. When Damian was born, I poured every ounce of myself into motherhood. I wasn't perfect, but I was present. I stayed up through his fevers, patched his jeans when they tore at the knees, and worked odd jobs to keep food on the table when Howard's hours were cut. But in Howard's family's eyes, none of that mattered. They saw me as a burden, a woman dragging their son down. The breaking point came during the financial collapse of Howard's small business. He had borrowed money under shady terms and cut corners with bookkeeping. When the authorities came knocking, Howard's family moved fast. They painted me as the one behind the mess. I was accused of signing papers I had never touched, of taking money I had never seen. Howard, the man I had once trusted with my life, stood silent while his family twisted the knife. He didn't defend me. He didn't stop them. He let me be the scapegoat. I will never forget the day they led me away in handcuffs. Damian was only a little boy then, clutching the frame of the doorway, crying out for me. I screamed his name until my voice broke, but Howard's mother pulled him back, shielding his ears as if I were poison. In that moment, I was no longer Claudette the mother, Claudette the wife. I was the wretched woman they wanted gone. The courtroom was just a formality. Their connections, their lies, and Howard's silence sealed my fate. I was sentenced, and with the slam of a gavel, everything I loved was stripped away. Damian was handed fully into Howard's care. I became a ghost in my own son's life. A name spat like dirt whenever he asked why his mother wasn't there. Prison was a cage, but the greater prison was knowing my son was being raised to hate me. Howard's family told him I had chosen disgrace over him, that I cared more about schemes than about being his mother. The worst part is that Damian believed it. Letters I sent never reached him. Calls went unanswered. Holidays came and went in silence. And with each passing year, the words wretched woman hardened around me like a brand burned into my skin. I carried that humiliation every day I spent behind bars. It wasn't just the bars that held me. It was the shame of being erased from my son's life, my marriage, my community. I had been stripped of dignity, stripped of reputation, stripped of motherhood itself. And for years, I thought I might never find a way back. But even as they called me wretched, I held on to one truth in the pit of my soul, that the story wasn't over, that one day the same family who laughed as I was led away would see that Claudette Jones wasn't finished. And that day would come. What hurt more than the clanging gates was the silence from the outside world. Those first months, I clung to the hope that Damian might remember me, that Howard might at least let him send a crayon drawing or a letter with crooked words. Mother's Day came that first spring, and I waited like a fool. I asked the guard 3 times if mail had come. Nothing. I told myself it was too soon. The next year came, and again, nothing. By the 3rd Mother's Day, I stopped asking. I learned to keep my face straight while other women wept over cards and pictures from their children. I had no cards, no calls, no visits. My son had been taught I didn't exist. I tried to reach him. I wrote letters with shaking hands, pouring my heart onto paper, telling him stories about when he was little, about how I loved him more than life itself. Most of those letters never left the mailroom. Howard's family made sure of that. The few that did were likely intercepted. I imagined Damian's eyes skimming over my words and then turning away in disgust, because that's what he'd been taught to feel. Every scrap of news I got about him came secondhand, through women whose sisters or cousins lived in the same neighborhood as Howard's family. I heard he was excelling in school, that he played basketball, that he had a smile like mine. Though he didn't know it, I heard he called another woman Mom. Each story was a dagger and a bomb all at once. I was glad he was thriving, but every word reminded me I wasn't part of it. Prison years grind you down. You learn to fight for respect with women who've lost everything, and you learn to sleep with one ear open. I saw women crumble under the weight of time. Some numbed themselves with contraband. Some carved lines into their arms just to feel alive. I had nothing but my memories and my rage. Rage at Howard for his betrayal. Rage at his family for painting me a villain. Rage at Damian for believing them. That rage became my fuel. There were nights I lay on my bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying the moment Damian stood in that doorway, crying as they dragged me away. In my mind, I screamed louder, fought harder, broke free, and ran to him. But memory is a cruel warden. It keeps you trapped in the moment you failed. And I had failed, at least in his eyes. Estrangement isn't just distance. It's a wall built brick by brick, lie by lie, silence by silence. By the time my sentence ended, that wall between Damian and me felt like it stretched higher than any prison gate. I walked out with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart that had been taught to expect nothing from him ever again. Still, somewhere deep inside, a quiet vow lived. They had called me the wretched woman, erased me from my son's life, and left me for dead. But I swore that prison wouldn't be the final chapter. If the world refused to send me cards and calls, then one day I would write my own story back into existence. And I would do it in a way none of them could ignore. The day I walked out of prison, the sky felt wider than it ever had before. The air was sharp, almost sweet. I should have felt free, but freedom doesn't mean much when you step into the world with nothing but a plastic bag of state-issued clothes and a record that screams felon. Howard didn't come. Damian didn't come. No one was waiting at those gates. I stood there alone, the gravel crunching under my shoes, knowing I had no home, no money, no family to lean on. The state gave me a bus ticket and $40. That was the price of my freedom. I rented a bed in a halfway house where the walls were thin and the rules stricter than prison. Every morning, I set out with a list of addresses, chasing work. I learned quickly how people looked at you when you wrote down your past on an application. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Check yes, and watch the manager's smile vanish. So I took what I could. I scrubbed toilets in motels where guests never looked me in the eye. I flipped burgers in diners until my back ached from standing. I cleaned offices after hours, pushing a mop down long hallways, humming to myself so the silence wouldn't swallow me. It wasn't dignified, but it was survival. At night, while the younger women at the halfway house wasted their time chasing men or drinking cheap liquor, I sat under the glow of a library lamp. I read books on finance, real estate, entrepreneurship, anything that might show me a way out of the grind. I copied notes by hand, memorized terms I barely understood, and told myself that knowledge was the only currency they couldn't take from me. The world didn't let me forget who I had been. At the bus stop, I overheard neighbors whispering when they recognized me. At the grocery store, A cashier muttered, "That's her," under her breath. To them, I was still the wretched woman who went to prison, the mother who abandoned her child. Shame followed me like a shadow, but I refused to let it choke me. I saved every penny I could. I stopped buying coffee, walked instead of riding the bus, wore the same 3 shirts until the seams frayed. Slowly, I scraped together a small cushion. When I finally moved out of the halfway house into a one-room apartment, I cried, not from joy, but from the quiet dignity of turning the key into a door that was mine. There were nights I wanted to give up, when the weight of loneliness pressed against my chest so hard I thought I'd break. But every time, I reminded myself they left me for dead. If I quit now, they win. If I rose, even if nobody saw it yet, I would be proof that they hadn't destroyed me. It was in those quiet, grinding years that I began to dream again. I didn't know yet how I would build something lasting, but the fire had returned. I told myself that survival was only the first step. One day, survival would turn into success. And success, when it came, would not be hidden in the shadows forever. I was still penniless, still stigmatized, still broken in some places. But brick by brick, I was laying the foundation for the life that would one day become my revenge. It started with a chance conversation in a break room. I was cleaning offices in the evenings then, pushing a mop across marble floors while executives laughed about vacations I couldn't dream of affording. One night, I overheard 2 young assistants talking. They weren't bragging about trips or promotions. They were talking about renting out their apartments on some new platform called Airbnb. I made enough in one weekend to cover half my rent. One of them said, I froze mid-swipe, listening. Half a rent check in a weekend. For me, that was more than a week's wages. That night, I went home to my one-room apartment and looked it up on the library computer. The idea was simple. List a room, host travelers, and earn money. It sounded impossible, too good to be true. Who would want to stay in my tiny, drafty apartment? But desperation and curiosity are cousins, and I decided to try. I borrowed a friend's camera, cleaned my place until it gleamed, and posted a listing with pictures that made my plain little apartment look almost charming. I priced it low, thinking nobody would bite. To my shock, within days I got my first booking. A couple passing through town. They handed me money, slept in the same bed I made with shaking hands, and left me a glowing review. That one weekend changed everything. From then on, I saw my apartment not as a box I survived in, but as an asset. I rearranged furniture, painted the walls, added secondhand decor I scavenged from thrift shops, and watched as more bookings rolled in. The cash trickled first, then began to flow. I stopped spending on anything but necessities. Every dollar I earned from hosting, I saved and reinvested. When my lease ended, I didn't renew it. I found a 2-bedroom apartment instead. I lived in the smaller room and rented the larger one full-time. My neighbors thought I was crazy letting strangers stay, but I saw what they didn't. Each stranger was a step closer to freedom. I hustled harder than I ever had in my life. I worked my day jobs, hosted at night, cleaned between guests, and managed bookings on library computers. I learned photography tricks to make rooms look bigger, studied hospitality to keep reviews high, and stretched myself so thin I barely slept. My hands were raw from scrubbing floors. My back ached from hauling furniture. But every time that payout hit, I felt the tide turning. Within 2 years, I had saved enough to rent a small house, furnishing it piece by piece and listing it online. That house filled. Then another. Before long, I wasn't just surviving off Airbnb. I was building something. My pennies had become thousands. For the first time since prison, I felt powerful. I no longer waited on anyone to give me permission. I no longer cared who whispered when I walked by. Each booking, each glowing review, each month of steady profit was proof that the wretched woman was wretched no more. I didn't tell Howard. I didn't tell Damian. To them, I was still invisible, still erased. And that was fine by me. I wanted to grow in silence. I wanted to rise in the shadows until the day came when they would see me, not because I chased them, but because they could no longer ignore me. That day was still far off, but for the first time in years, I could feel it drawing closer. I had cracked open a door to a new life, and nothing, not shame, not fatigue, not the scars of the past, was going to stop me from walking through it. Time has a way of slipping by when you're consumed with building. One property became two became four. Before I knew it, I was juggling listings across 3 different neighborhoods, then across 2 states. What started as a gamble on a 1-room apartment had turned into something much bigger, an empire I controlled in silence. I learned quickly that in business, visibility can be dangerous. A woman like me, a black woman with a record, wasn't supposed to succeed in real estate. Banks turned me away, investors laughed, and competitors underestimated me. That was fine. Their doubt was my cover. I built everything under the radar, using LLCs and trusted partners' names where I needed them, making sure that when people searched for Claudette Jones, all they saw was the ghost of a woman they once called wretched. Behind the curtain, though, I was orchestrating every move. I reinvested every dollar, snapping up rundown houses others overlooked, transforming them into rentals that travelers flocked to. I learned market cycles, mastered zoning laws, and built relationships quietly with contractors who respected my discipline. I never flaunted what I had. I didn't need to. By my mid-50s, I was holding deeds in cities Howard's family had never stepped foot in. Chicago, Charlotte, Houston, a growing portfolio that stretched further than anyone could guess. My calendar was filled with renovations, openings, and bookings, yet not a word of it reached Damian. To him, I was still a ghost. And that's exactly how I wanted it. I kept my circle small. Aunt Louisa knew pieces of the truth, enough to remind me that I wasn't crazy for dreaming as big as I did. A trusted business partner handled paperwork when my name might draw suspicion. Beyond that, I stayed silent. No social media, no community appearances. I declined every offer that might put my face on a website or in a magazine. Recognition was a temptation I couldn't afford. Why? Because power tastes sweeter when it's revealed at the right time. If Howard or Damian ever caught wind of my rise, they'd twist it into something ugly, just as they always had. I wasn't ready for them to know. Not yet. Instead, I worked. I drove through neighborhoods where kids played on cracked sidewalks and saw opportunity in every boarded-up window. I negotiated deals at kitchen tables with families desperate to sell. I put in the sweat when I had to, and when I couldn't, I paid people well to do the work. My reputation among contractors was quiet but solid. I was the woman who paid on time, never complained, and kept her word. The money grew. What was once pennies became thousands, then tens of thousands. By the time I turned 60, I could walk into any dealership and point to the shiniest car on the lot. I could buy jewelry that sparkled brighter than the chandeliers in Howard's family home. But I didn't. I lived modestly, at least on the surface, because this wasn't about flaunting. This was about preparing. Even in wealth, Damian haunted me. I could walk into the finest hotel lobby, dressed in clothes that cost more than I once made in a month, and still catch my breath at the sight of a stranger who resembled him. A tilt of the head, a shape of the jaw, a voice across the room. Suddenly, I was back in that doorway, watching him cry as they dragged me away in handcuffs. I told myself I had moved on, that my silence, my empire, my comfort were proof enough that I no longer needed his recognition. But blood has a way of tugging at you, even when it's poisoned. I hired people quietly to keep me updated. I knew where he lived. I knew the college he graduated from, the company where he built his career, the type of car he drove. I even knew the kind of woman he dated before he settled on Vanessa. Sometimes I would drive past his neighborhood, slow enough to see the lights on in his windows. I never knocked, never called. I just stared from the safety of my car, wondering if he hated me as much as I feared, or worse, if he didn't think of me at all. That was when Aunt Louisa's voice would echo in my ear. She was the only one who never doubted me, the only one who saw more than the headlines and the whispers. Louisa was older than me, sharp-tongued but tender-hearted, and she had lived long enough to understand the poison of holding on. "Child," she told me once as we sat in her kitchen sipping tea, "you've carried Damian in your heart so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to walk free of him. You've built all this." She gestured toward the portfolio documents I'd stacked on her table. "And yet you're still chained to a boy who doesn't even say your name." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that a mother never lets go, that no amount of money could replace the ache of being erased. But the truth was in her eyes. I had turned my silence into success, but I hadn't turned it into peace. She pressed my hand and leaned closer. "If he wants to believe lies, let him. You don't need to prove yourself to him. Claudette, you've already done the proving." I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Not then, because every night when I closed my eyes, I saw Damian at the altar of some future I hadn't been invited to. I saw him standing tall, surrounded by people who believed I was nothing. And in those visions, I wasn't crying anymore. I was walking into that room, into that life, and watching every lie unravel. Aunt Louisa urged me to let go, to find peace in what I had built. But the ghost of Damian was everywhere. He was in the faces of strangers, in the laughter of children passing by, in the silence that hung heavy on Mother's Days. He was in the questions I asked myself in the dark. Did he hate me? Did he ever miss me? Did he ever wonder if the story he was told was the truth? I didn't know. And maybe I didn't want to, because I had begun to realize something. Ghosts don't just haunt you, they drive you. And Damian's ghost was driving me toward a reckoning neither of us could avoid. The call from Damian never left me. His voice, sharp with contempt, wasn't a bridge reaching for reconciliation. It was bait. He wanted me as a spectacle, a living cautionary tale he could parade at his wedding. In his mind, I was still the wretched woman, ragged and pitiful, dragged from the shadows into the light, so his guests could laugh and pity him for surviving me. But I wasn't the same Claudette he thought he remembered. He wanted me to play the role of Disgrace, Instead, I decided to make his stage mine. I began to prepare, not with trembling hands, but with the precision of a general mapping out a campaign. The first call I made was to my head of security, a man whose quiet presence alone could silence a room. "I need 2 of your best," I told him, discreet, polished, and unshakable. He didn't ask why. He knew me well enough to understand that when I called, it wasn't for vanity, it was for strategy. Next came the car. Not just any car. I ordered a Rolls-Royce Ghost, sleek and silver, the kind of machine that glided more than it drove. It wasn't about showing off. It was about symbolism. I was the ghost of Damian's past, returning in a form he couldn't ignore, haunting the lies he built his life upon. Then came the outfit. I visited a private tailor, one who measured not just my body, but my posture, my stance, my presence. I chose a tailored suit in deep navy, with lines so sharp they looked like they could cut, a pair of heels that added height without compromising balance, a pearl necklace, understated but unmistakable. Everything about the look said, "I am not the woman you thought you buried." Back at home, I pulled open a drawer I rarely touched. Inside was a small box, worn at the edges. Inside that box lay a faded photograph of Damian as a boy, 5 years old, his hand wrapped around mine, his smile wide and unguarded. For a moment, my chest tightened. I traced the edges of the photo with my finger, remembering the sound of his laughter before the world turned him against me. But then I slipped the photo back into the box and locked it away. That was my signal. Love had carried me this far, but love alone couldn't stand on that stage. What I needed now was resolve. Everything was set. The bodyguards, the ghost, the outfit, the plan. Damian thought I would show up broken. Instead, I would arrive as proof of survival, dressed in the armor of my triumph. He wanted a wretched woman. What he would see was the reckoning of his own choices. The war had been declared, and I was ready for battle. The day of the wedding, the sky was clear, the air almost too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My Rolls-Royce Ghost hummed beneath me, like a secret I had carried for decades, ready to be revealed. As we turned onto the long driveway leading to the venue, I could already see the clusters of guests shimmering in silk dresses and pressed suits, sipping champagne as if their laughter could cover the cracks in their lives. The engine's quiet growl drew heads before the car even stopped. The chrome grille caught the sun, blinding, commanding. Whispers moved through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Who had arrived in a ghost? Which dignitary? Which magnate? They weren't expecting me. Not me. The car slowed to a stop at the entrance. My driver opened the door, and one of my bodyguards stepped out first, tall, broad, and dressed in a black suit that looked carved out of stone. Another followed, scanning the crowd with a gaze that silenced even the nosiest guests. Then, slowly I stepped out. The air shifted. I had chosen a navy suit tailored to perfection, with heels that clicked against the pavement like a metronome of power. Pearls rested at my throat, simple but unmistakable, each gleam a reminder that I was no one's shadow anymore. I held my chin high, my back straight, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the woman who had been dragged in handcuffs. I was the woman who had survived it. A collective murmur rolled through the crowd. The bride's family, not knowing who I was, smiled politely, assuming I was some distinguished guest. But on the other side, faces began to falter. Gasps rippled when recognition dawned. I caught the sharp intake of breath from Howard, his face flushed with a sudden, ugly red, his mouth falling open as if he'd seen a ghost. And then there was Damian. He turned, eyes locking onto me, and in that instant, the blood drained from his face. The smirk he'd worn all morning vanished. His knees seemed to weaken beneath him, his hand gripping the back of a chair, as if the earth itself had tilted. He hadn't expected this. He expected a ragged woman with shame in her eyes, not the mother he had erased stepping out in glory. I walked forward slowly, deliberately, letting every step echo. My bodyguards flanked me, but it wasn't their presence that kept the crowd silent. It was mine. I looked at Damian, and for a flicker of a second, I saw the boy he had once been, the boy who clutched the doorway, crying for me. Then it was gone, replaced by the man who had called to humiliate me. I didn't break eye contact as I crossed the threshold of that venue. The music faltered, the laughter died, and all that remained was the sound of my heels on stone. The wretched woman had arrived, not in shame, but in triumph. And in that moment, Damian's perfect stage began to crumble beneath him. The moment Damian's eyes locked on me, his body betrayed him. His hand gripped the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles went white, and for a heartbeat I thought he might collapse entirely. His carefully pressed suit, his groomed smile, his performance of control, all of it shattered in an instant. The son who once vowed to disgrace me was now the one crumbling before a crowd. The shock spread outward like a ripple in water. Guests leaned in, whispering, their faces puzzled first, then stunned. Some recognized me immediately, mouths falling open as though a ghost had truly stepped into the room. Others, unfamiliar with the history, looked back and forth, confusion written on their faces, trying to piece together why the groom's color had drained and why his father's lips had twisted into a scowl. Howard's gasp had been sharp enough to cut through the music, and when I caught his eye, the years peeled away. He looked older, heavier, but the arrogance was still there. Only now fear edged it. He had expected me to remain buried in silence, never daring to show my face again. Seeing me walk in with my head high was a reckoning he couldn't have prepared for. I walked past both of them without flinching, my heels steady against the stone floor. I turned my gaze instead toward the bride, Vanessa King, radiant in white, with eyes full of hope and uncertainty, stared at me as if trying to solve a puzzle in real time. I stopped in front of her, extended my hand, and smiled with the warmth of a woman who carried no shame. "Congratulations," I said evenly. "I'm Claudette Jones, Damian's mother." The silence that followed was louder than any string quartet could have played. Glasses hovered halfway to lips. Forks paused in midair. Every eye swung between me and Damian, between my calm introduction and his unraveling composure. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. In all her planning, she had clearly not been prepared for this entrance. Her grip was tentative as she placed her hand in mine, her voice soft. I didn't know you'd be here." Damian shifted, his mouth opening and closing, no words finding him. This was his perfect day, his carefully choreographed stage. Yet here I was, not broken, not begging, not hiding, but standing tall, introducing myself as though I belonged. Because I did. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to fight. My presence alone was enough. The woman they called wretched had arrived, not in rags, not in disgrace, but in glory. And as Damian swayed under the weight of that truth, I knew the collapse had already begun. The reception buzzed with whispers, the kind that slithered just under the music, thick with speculation. Everywhere I walked, I felt eyes trailing me, guests tugging their partner's sleeves, whispering, "That's her." I could read the questions in their faces. Why was Damian trembling? Why had Howard gone pale? Why did this woman, dismissed for so long, look like she owned the room? They didn't have to wait long for an answer. One of Howard's sisters, bold with wine and arrogance, clinked her glass and raised her voice. "We're so proud of Damian," she announced, smiling wide. Proud that he found it in his heart to invite his mother. It takes a special man to forgive the past, to show such grace. The words dripped with condescension, meant to reduce me to a sinner crawling for scraps of mercy. A few guests nodded, unsure. Others glanced at me, curious to see if I would shrink. I did not shrink. I rose. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my napkin on the table and picked up my glass. The room hushed, the clinking of cutlery fading into silence. My bodyguards stood still at the edges of the hall, but I didn't need them now. My presence was enough. I lifted my glass high. "A toast," I said, my voice steady and clear. "To my son, Damian, and his beautiful bride, Vanessa. May your union be blessed." I paused, letting the politeness hang in the air, before I cut through it like a blade. "But before you drink, let me tell you something true." Every eye fixed on me. Damian shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his hand trembling against his thigh. Howard stared down at his plate. "I have been called the wretched woman," I began. "I have been painted as a mother who abandoned her child, who chose disgrace over love. And for years, I carried that name in silence. But let me be clear tonight. I did not abandon my son. I was taken from him." Gasps broke out in the hall. Vanessa's eyes widened, searching Damian's face. The bride's parents exchanged uneasy glances. I was led away in handcuffs while my son cried for me in the doorway. I continued, my voice unwavering. And those who should have stood for me, those who should have spoken the truth, stood silent instead. Lies were told, and my name was buried. But what they did not bury was my spirit. I set the glass down, my free hand steady on the table. I walked through prison. I walked through poverty. I scrubbed floors. I starved. I studied by library lights. And brick by brick, I built a life again. Not in shame, but in dignity. Not in failure, but in triumph. I did not crawl back. I rose. The silence was deafening. Even the servers froze, trays in their hands. I looked at Damian directly, holding his gaze so he could not turn away. My son was told a story, that I was nothing, that I was unworthy, that I was gone. But I stand here now, not to beg for forgiveness, not to seek approval, but to remind him and all of you that the truth cannot stay buried forever. I raised my glass once more. To Damian and Vanessa, may you build your marriage on truth, not lies. Because lies, no matter how polished, always crack under the weight of time. I drank, slowly, and when I lowered my glass, the hall stayed silent. No applause, no forced cheer, just the weight of revelation pressing down on every guest until all that could be heard was the pounding of Damian's heart as he shifted in his chair, exposed at last. The silence after my toast hung heavy, thick enough to choke on. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Damian exploded. He shot up from his chair, his voice cracking like glass. You think this is your stage. You think you can just walk in here and ruin my day. His words came fast, sharp, desperate. You've ruined everything. Everything. His face flushed crimson, veins rising in his neck as he pointed at me with a trembling hand. Guests shrank back in their seats, eyes wide. Vanessa's family shifted uncomfortably, the bride herself frozen in her gown, staring at the man she had just married, as though seeing him for the first time. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I simply sat, glass in hand, watching the son who once thought he held power over me, now unraveling in front of everyone he wanted to impress. You left me, he roared, his voice breaking. You abandoned me. And now you come here, acting like you're better than us? You'll never be more than what you've always been. Never. His words tumbled out like stones, heavy, jagged, clumsy. Howard tried to hush him, gripping his arm, but Damian shook him off violently. Don't touch me. This is her fault. All of it. She wants to humiliate me on my wedding day. The more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. His carefully polished mask of control was gone, replaced by a man cornered by truth he couldn't handle. His rage didn't expose me. It exposed him. I stayed calm, my body still, my expression composed. I let the storm rage across the hall while I sat untouched, an island in the chaos. The contrast was undeniable. Damian's fury was fire, wild and destructive. My composure was stone, unmoving, undeniable. And in that hall, every eye saw the difference. The whispers returned, louder this time, no longer speculation, but judgment. Guests shook their heads. Some pitied him. Some looked at me with a respect I hadn't felt in years. Vanessa's parents avoided his eyes altogether. I took one slow sip from my glass. Sit down, Damian, I said softly, my voice calm enough to cut through his shouting. You're only proving what I already knew. The words hit him harder than any scream could have. He faltered, his chest heaving, his eyes darting around the room at the faces turned toward him. He saw it then, the truth. He hadn't disgraced me. He had disgraced himself. And all I had done was tell the truth. After the storm of the reception, I didn't stay for cake, for dancing, or for speeches that meant nothing. My part was already done. Still, before I left, I asked for a moment alone with Damian. We met in a small side room off the hall, away from the curious eyes of guests and the whispers that were already reshaping the story of the evening. He stood stiff, his jaw set, his fists clenched. The same boy who once cried for me at the doorway was now a man who looked at me with fury and shame mixed in his eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply stood there, pearls at my throat, posture steady, and said what needed to be said. I don't hate you, Damian. I began. But I don't love you either. Not anymore. That bond, the one that tied us when you were a child, it died the day you chose their lies over the truth. I lived with my choices. Now you will live with yours. He opened his mouth to speak, but I lifted a hand, stopping him. You can call me wretched. You can spit my name to anyone who'll listen. But what you cannot do is erase what I've survived. I carried chains. I carried shame. And still, I rose. Whatever you carry now, that's on you. His face faltered, his body trembling like he might break apart, right there. But I felt no pity. Not anymore. I turned toward the door, my heels striking the tile with the same calm rhythm they had when I first entered. My bodyguards closed in on either side of me, their presence a wall between me and the past that had once devoured me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Damian was already broken, not by my hands, but by the truth he could no longer outrun. I walked out of that venue with my head high, the so-called wretched woman leaving not in disgrace, but in power. Behind me, Damian was left with the pieces of his own ruin. When I look back on my life, I see chains and cages, tears and humiliation, but I also see a woman who refused to stay buried. They called me wretched. They erased my name, stripped me of dignity, and taught my son to despise me. For years, I carried that brand like a scar across my soul. But scars tell stories, and mine tells one of survival. Success became my revenge. Every property I bought, every deal I closed, every key that turned in a new lock was proof that I had not been destroyed. I didn't need billboards or headlines. My victories lived in silence until the day I chose to reveal them. That day came at Damian's wedding, and with it, the reckoning I had waited for. I didn't arrive to beg for forgiveness. I didn't come to mend what had long been broken. I came to show the truth that I had not abandoned my son, I had been taken from him. That I had not crumbled under shame, I had rebuilt in power. That I was never the wretched woman, though they tried to make me believe it. Standing in that hall, watching Damian unravel under the weight of his own hatred, I felt no joy, no sorrow, only clarity. The tables had turned not because I shouted louder, but because I stood taller. My dignity was my weapon, and it cut deeper than rage ever could. I didn't forgive. I didn't reconcile. Some wounds do not heal, and some bonds are not meant to be repaired. Damian will remember me however he chooses, perhaps as the mother who collapsed his perfect day, perhaps as the ghost who refused to stay buried. That's his burden to carry. But the truth is simpler than all of that. The wretched woman was wretched no more, and that was enough.